July 7, 1937. Shooting breaks out between Japanese and Chinese troops stationed in Beijing. The significance of the fighting isn't immediately clear, with only a few hundred men dying. However, that small skirmish would trigger a total war between the two countries that would last 8 years and claim the lives of 20 million people. Tensions between Japan and China had been rising for over 40 years as Japan had been steadily taking more and more Chinese territory. First, they took Taiwan in 1895. Then, in 1931, Japan annexed the Chinese province of Manchuria. The territory was renamed Manchukuo and was garrisoned with one of Japan's most brutal military units. Throughout the 1930s, Japan continued its expansion, taking the province of Rihi and then Hebei. Japan was able to take all this territory because China was engulfed in civil war. Since 1927, it had been crippled by a power struggle between the Chinese government led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communist guerrillas led by Mao Zedong. The civil war had weakened China, leaving unable to repel the Japanese aggression. It was clear that there was soon to be a total war with Japan, and so in 1936, Chiang Kai-shek was forced to agree to cooperate with the communists to fight their common enemy. The war with Japan broke out only 8 months later. Japanese and Chinese troops in Beijing began firing at each other, leading both sides to send reinforcements. Before they knew it, China and Japan were engaged in a war that would leave both countries devastated. Japan's first act was to send 200,000 troops to northern China, and they quickly occupied Beijing. China made little attempt to defend the city. Chiang Kai-shek knew that Beijing would be impossible to defend as the troops there were ill-trained and small in number. His strategy was to focus his resources on the defense of Shanghai, where the Chinese would fight tooth and nail to repel the Japanese. Unfortunately for China, the Japanese already had troops stationed very near Shanghai due to an agreement made 4 years earlier. Chiang Kai-shek urgently needed to force those troops off the mainland as fast as possible before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. However, that would be difficult. The Chinese had more men, but the Japanese were well entrenched, better trained and better equipped. Over the next few days, the Chinese took enormous losses, advancing into heavy machine gun fire, but ultimately failed to drive out the Japanese. Japanese reinforcements arrived by sea, and the Chinese began to lose ground. The Japanese made several amphibious landings along the coast, and the Chinese forces were unable to hold them off. Eventually, in danger of being surrounded, the Chinese forces were forced to abandon Shanghai. They had lost more than half of their elite troops, as well as equipment that would be difficult to replace. With Shanghai secure, the Japanese now set their sights on China's capital, Nanking, only 300 kilometers away. The Chinese made no attempt to defend the city. Realizing that they had no chance of resisting, they withdrew their forces further west and allowed the Japanese to take Nanking unopposed. They may have hoped that not resisting would mean that the Japanese would spare the city much violence. That could not have been further from the truth. When the Japanese reached Nanking, they committed one of the worst war crimes of the century, a massacre so brutal that it came to be known as the Rape of Nanking. Over 6 weeks, roughly 200,000 civilians were murdered by Japanese men. The massacre was notable for the truly sadistic nature of the violence. Babies were thrown into the air and caught on the bayonets of Japanese rifles. In one infamous story, 2 Japanese soldiers had a contest to see who could be the first to kill 100 people. Thousands of Chinese women were gang raped, and once the Japanese men had had their fill, they were murdered. While that was happening, Chiang Kai-shek was setting up Chongqing as China's new capital. Chongqing was far west and surrounded by mountains, so it would be much easier to defend. The Japanese continued their advance, and by June of 1938, they were at the gates of Wuhan. There was one potential way to slow the Japanese advance, but it would come at a huge cost. Running along the north of China is the Yellow River, which in some places is held back by dikes. If those dikes were destroyed, the surrounding area would flood and be impassable to the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek decided to go ahead with the plan, and the dikes were destroyed. The resulting flood did impede the Japanese progress, but the cost to civilians was horrific. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from drowning, famine and disease, and millions were displaced. In spite of that enormous sacrifice, the flood didn't prevent the Japanese from taking Wuhan, which fell in October of 1938. The Chinese had lost a huge part of their country. With the victory at Wuhan, the Japanese advance began to stall and the war entered a period of stalemate. Nevertheless, the Japanese now control a huge part of China and almost half the population. For those living in the occupied territories, the Japanese were sadistic masters. They set up biological research facilities that engaged in evil human experimentation. The most famous is Unit 731, where roughly 300,000 people died. Experiments included the injection of diseases or animal blood, deliberate dehydration, or surgery without anesthesia. Limbs were amputated to see how fast the victim would die of blood loss. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to their intestines. The victims included children and even babies born of the rape carried out by the staff. Flamethrowers were tested on live people, with the victims tied to stakes and burned alive. In other experiments, victims were placed in low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. In the final moments of the Second World War, all prisoners were killed to conceal evidence. There were no survivors. The Japanese also engaged in research into biological weapons. They developed disease bombs, where fleas infected with bubonic plague were dispersed from aeroplanes over Chinese cities. That led to epidemics that killed tens of thousands. More than 11 Chinese cities were attacked with disease bombs. The Japanese also did evil things to cater to their enormous army occupying China. The Japanese government wanted to prevent the mass rape of Chinese women, as it would generate anti-Japanese sentiment. Brothels were set up to cater to the sexual urges of their troops. Around 300,000 Chinese women were tricked into sexual slavery in the brothels. That kind of evil extended all across the Japanese-occupied territories. Back on the front line in August of 1940, an offensive was launched by the Chinese Communists. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek were formally allied against the Japanese, but in reality there was very little cooperation between the two. Both men knew that as soon as the war with Japan finished, the war between them would restart. The two armies also had different fighting styles. The Communists used guerrilla tactics, merging with the civilian population and disrupting Japanese supply lines. The forces of Chiang Kai-shek, on the other hand, fought as a regular army. In August of 1940, the Communists launched an offensive behind Japanese lines, destroying railways, bridges and factories. It was extremely difficult for the Japanese to counter this, as the Communists were hiding within the civilian population. As a result, they resorted to extreme brutality in what became known as the policy of the three alls. The Japanese soldiers were to kill all, burn all and loot all. Since they couldn't distinguish between the Chinese soldiers and civilians, they were to kill everyone. 3 million Chinese died as a result of this policy alone. However, the three alls policy did achieve its objective. The Communists would never again mount a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese. It was at that moment, when it seemed like there was little hope for China, that Japan made one of the worst strategic decisions in all of military history. It attacked the United States of America. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Air Force launched a surprise attack on the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. The US immediately declared war on Japan and dramatically increased its economic and military aid to China. For China, this was incredibly good news, and Chiang Kai-shek knew it. The economic aid was desperately needed, as China's economy was collapsing and inflation was soaring. The government also had to feed and employ millions of refugees that had fled the Japanese occupation. The Japanese wanted to force Chiang Kai-shek to surrender, but the new Chinese capital of Chongqing was far west, and so it would be extremely difficult to take. Their strategy was to try to force the Chinese to submit by bombing the city and cutting off its supply routes. Chongqing had been receiving supplies through Hong Kong, and so Japan occupied the city in December of 1941. Shortly afterwards, Japan invaded much of Asia, making it even harder to get supplies to Chongqing. This was a huge problem for the Chinese, and they would, not for the last time, be saved by the United States. The decision was made to start supplying China by air from India, flying over the Himalayas. This challenging route was nicknamed the Hump due to the mountainous landscape. The planes took off from northeastern India and flew 800 kilometers to China, making it the longest aerial supply route in history. With the entrance of the USA into the war, Japan very quickly had to divert its attention away from China. However, the Chinese civilians continued to suffer. In 1942, the province of Henan suffered a severe drought. Henan had been badly affected by the Yellow River flood, and so the drought led to a deadly famine. Families had to resort to desperate measures such as selling their children or eating tree leaves. Around 700,000 people died and millions fled the region. The battlefront between Japan and China remained largely static from 1940 to 1944. Japanese-occupied China became a vassal state led by Wang Jingwei. Jingwei had been a significant figure in Chinese politics for decades and had actually been involved in bringing down the Chinese Empire in 1911. Years later, he had engaged in a power struggle with Chiang Kai-shek to become the leader of their political party. After failing to become leader, Jingwei fell out with Chiang, and when war broke out with Japan in 1937, he accepted an invitation from the Japanese to form a puppet government. Jingwei would be head of state for the collaborationist government until 1944. In April of 1944, the Japanese broke the military stalemate when they launched Operation Ichigo, which means Operation Break the Continent. Its goal was to connect the areas of China that it occupied in the north and south. This would allow it to build a railway from Siberia to Singapore, facilitating trade and troop movements. The Japanese gathered about 500,000 men and advanced on the city of Luoyang. The Chinese resistance was hampered by a rebellion of peasants furious about the recent famine. Luoyang fell in May of 1944. The Japanese continued south and took several more cities. At the same time, around 100,000 Japanese troops advanced north from Guangzhou and were able to connect with the forces coming south. Operation Ichigo had achieved its objective, making a bridge from the Japanese-controlled areas in the north and south. They had lost 100,000 men, but China had lost around 600,000. The consequences for the Chinese government were catastrophic. They had lost control of 8 provinces, and crucially, they no longer had access to the sea. The Chinese resistance was on the verge of collapse. China would once again be saved by the United States of America. The USA was steadily advancing through the Pacific Islands, managing to conquer Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. It was also raining hell on the Japanese cities with its air force. Even Tokyo couldn't be protected by the Japanese, which was firebombed in March of 1945, killing 100,000 civilians. It would be the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that would finally end China's war with Japan. The Japanese emperor was forced to accept an unconditional surrender. On the Chinese mainland, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers laid down their weapons. The war was over. With the end of the war, trials were held in Tokyo, and 23 Japanese leaders were sentenced to death or life imprisonment for their crimes. However, those trials didn't convict the emperor and didn't investigate crimes such as the Nanking Massacre or Unit 731. The Chinese people had endured years of cruelty, murder and humiliation, which they'd faced with stoic and self-sacrificial resistance. China had lost 14 million civilians, more than any other nation during World War II. However, the end to that war didn't imply peace, but rather a return to the civil war that had been raging before Japan invaded. That would eventually be won by the communists led by Mao Zedong in 1949. That war will be covered in a future video.